Those drones are surveillance drones, but they are also drones that shoot people regularly. They were constantly being bombed, day and night. And what I think I found particularly disturbing was that a bomb would drop maybe on a crowded, tented area, and then the drones would come down and...
Please take your time. We're incredibly grateful that you're making the time to be here today.
So the drones would come down and pick off civilians, children, and we had description after description. This is not, an occasional thing. This was day after day after day, operating on children who would say, I was lying on the ground after a bomb had dropped, and this quadcopter came down and hovered over me and shot me. And that's clearly a deliberate act, and it was a persistent act, persistent targeting of civilians day after day.
We're talking little children,
yeah.
not late teens.
Well, from the majority of the children who were casualties were young children, but we had casualties in their teens, we had women in their 30s, and it was a very consistent story. And the bullets that the drones fire are these small cuboid pellets, and I fished a number of those out of the abdomen of small children. I think the youngest I operated on was a 3-year-old who had a major injury to the artery in her neck, and we used the last shunt, which is a device you use to bypass the artery in the neck to keep supplying blood to the brain. She died about 3 or 4 days later from infection.
You believe it was deliberate targeting of civilians?
Absolutely no question. This was clearly persistent, deliberate targeting of civilians. And I've worked in a number of conflict zones in different parts of the world. I was there at the time of the Rwandan genocide. I've never seen anything on this scale, ever. And that was also the view of all the experienced colleagues that I worked with. One of the surgeons in my team had been to Ukraine 5 times and said, this is 10 times worse. There doesn't seem to be a front line. There just seems to be 1.4 million people trapped, they can't leave, and having bombs dropped on them on a daily basis, and then drones coming in and shooting them. And there's plenty of evidence out there from Israeli soldiers that that's what's going on. But we saw it, we saw the results of it.
Can you talk a bit about the challenges that you face because of the lack of supplies? How does that manifest itself when you're trying to do your medical work?
Yeah, I mean, so I remember one Saturday night operating on an 8-year-old who was bleeding to death, and I asked for a swab, and they said, no more swabs. We had operations being done with no sterile gloves, no sterile drapes at various points. We had lack of basic equipment. I did amputations on people who just had to take paracetamol after the operation as pain relief. That medical aid was sitting at the border and not being allowed in. We were not allowed to take any medical equipment except for personal use. So I was asked, could I bring thyroid medication for some people? Couldn't take it in. That's a deliberate policy. And that's changed because I know that teams earlier in the year had been able to take some medical equipment in. So again, that seems to me to be a deliberate restriction of medical supplies. And basic things like soap, shampoo, that's not being allowed in. I saw, I don't know how many wounds with maggots in. One of my colleagues took maggots out of a child's throat in intensive care. There were flies in the operating theatre, landing in the wounds. It was appalling, and that's a deliberate choice. It's not an accident. You would have people with blast injuries, abdominal injuries, chest injuries, limbs blown off, head injuries. We saw a number of children with sniper injuries to the head, single shot to the head, no other injuries. So clearly deliberately targeted by Israeli snipers. We were worried about drones, couldn't leave the hospital, and travelling in and out was probably the most nerve-wracking thing. So we travelled in and out on a UN convoy in armoured vehicles. That's been shot at 5 times by the Israelis. And these are convoys that are very carefully organised, so they follow a predetermined route given to them by the Israeli army. There's a radio check at the start before they leave, during the journey and at the end, so the Israeli army know that they're there and where they are. And despite that, 5 times, including while we were there, they've been shot at. So my biggest fear while I was there was being killed by the Israelis.
The convoys that were shot at, was this sort of a rogue sniper, or was this...
No, this is the Israeli army coming up as a unit and deliberately shooting. And
UN convoy?
Yes. So the last one, when I was there, I think it would have been about the end of August, it was reported, some WHO staff, and these are armoured vehicles, so you can see, I think, 4-5 bullet marks in the window, just where someone would have been sitting. We were told, given very clear instructions, the doors are going to be locked when you set off. Do not unlock the doors. If the Israeli army shoot at you and order you out, do not get out of the vehicle. This is a UN convoy. It's got UN in big letters on the side. And it carries in twice a week. It carries about 30 to 40 aid workers from different organisations in and out. It's a huge number of aid workers have been targeted, and that's well documented. And again, to my mind, that's a deliberate. We would see people with sometimes a single entry point, sometimes 2 or 3. What we did see on 1 or 2 occasions was a very disturbing pattern where there'd be 3 or 4 shots here, 3 or 4 shots here, and again in the groin. And that we all thought was prima facie evidence of an autonomous drone or a semi-autonomous drone, because a human operator would not be able to fire with that degree of accuracy that quickly. But with the drone pellets, what I found was they would go in and they would bounce around, so they would cause multiple injuries. So I had a 7-year-old boy, the one I described earlier, who gave a very clear description. He had an entry point here. He came in with his stomach hanging out of his chest. He had an injury to his liver, spleen. Bowel, arteries. So quite extensive destruction from a single entry point. And he survived that and went out a week later. Whether he's still alive, I don't know. I mean, I've never been in a conflict area where medical aid has been restricted to that extent. I mean, it's not allowing supplies in, bombing healthcare facilities, attacking ambulances, killing healthcare workers. If all of that didn't happen, then tens of thousands of lives would be saved. And I would think that any army that is engaged in a war has a responsibility to the civilian population on both sides. And I'm seeing the opposite there. It's the equivalent of just putting a blockade around the city of London, saying you can't leave, and then dropping bombs month after month, and then closing down all the healthcare facilities. That's what's happening. And it's astonishing that it's continuing. I mean, we all found that it was beyond belief that this could continue. And there's a sense of resignation that they're all just waiting to die, with no chance of escape.
Going back to the sort of points around targeting, was there a threat that the Israeli Defence Force was seeing? Was Hamas in the community? Could you see where it was? Or
yeah, I'm laughing because this was the question I asked when I got there. So, you know, is Hamas in the hospital? Have they been in the hospital? And they just laughed at me. And they said, there is no Hamas. There's a few fighters hiding in tunnels. There's no Hamas. There never was any Hamas in the hospital. Everybody hates Hamas. And, you know, we never saw any evidence in the street, in the hospital. You know, as I say, I've been in conflict zones before. Normally, if fighters come in, they come in with guns. They come in with their friends with guns. We never saw any of that. We were allowed to go wherever we wanted in the hospital. With ironic laughter, they described one of their colleagues when Nasser Hospital was attacked by the Israelis in February, and they killed a number of staff, put them in a mass grave along with a number of patients. That's well documented. But they described one of their colleagues who was taken away, detained, along with a number of others, who was killed in detention. And they said, well, he was an atheist and he hated Hamas, and he was, before the war, he was very vociferous about those things. He just thought Islam was stupid, and he thought Hamas was stupid, and they took him away and killed him. That's what's going on. It's not as far as I can see, it doesn't matter who you are in Gaza. If you're Palestinian, you're a target. It's just a consistent attempt to essentially wipe out a large part of the population. And I think the other theme that comes through again and again when you talk to people is the humiliation, the aggression. So I was operating on one young girl one night who died not long afterwards, and I can't even begin to describe her injuries. But when I'd finished operating on her, an ophthalmologist was trying to take out her left eye, which was just pulp. And he was a lovely, gentle man, maybe 5 years older than me. And he was, while he was working, he was just saying, yeah, when they came in February, they got all of us who were still here, they put our hands behind our backs, tied them up, put a hood over our heads, made us stand for 10 hours, beat us, cursed us in Arabic, humiliated us. And then some were taken away, some were killed, some were detained, some were released. We had a medical student who worked with us, who described how the women had all been lined up and been told to strip down to their underwear and made to stand for hours like that, which is deeply, deeply humiliating, particularly in that culture. And then when they told her she could go, they wouldn't give her her clothes back, so she had to run through the streets like that, which for her was extremely traumatic. So there's a consistent theme of attack, humiliation, aggression against people who are simply trying to do their job, to try and help people in the worst possible circumstances.
You said they did this to the medics. Who?
Israeli army. What's not picked up by a lot of the statistics is children who've had both legs blown off. People who've got ongoing problems as a result. When I left, the WHO was trying to construct a tented area within the hospital grounds just to deal with constructing prosthetic limbs for people who'd lost limbs in the war. You know, it's a huge, huge number.